White silk clings to sweating skin. 200 guests stare in suffocating silence. A crumpled piece of paper sits crushed in a trembling, manicured hand, bearing 3 cowardly words: "I can't stay." Humiliation tastes like cheap champagne and bile. As whispers ripple through the pews, a heavy rhythmic footstep eclipses the murmurs. A man built of tailored wool and unspoken violence steps out of the shadows. He doesn't offer pity. He offers a hand. The cathedral smelled aggressively of Casablanca lilies and floor wax. It was a thick, cloying scent, the kind that coats the back of your throat and makes it hard to swallow. Harper stood at the altar, her spine locked rigid, a forced, plastic smile slowly fracturing on her face. 10 minutes. That was how long she had been standing up here since the bridal march finished. 10 minutes of shifting her weight from her left foot to her right, feeling the blister on her heel split and ooze against the stiff leather of her designer pump. Chase, the best man, looked like he was going to vomit. His face was the color of old oatmeal, slick with sweat under the heavy amber lighting of the altar. He kept shifting his gaze from the heavy oak doors at the back of the church to his phone, then to the floor. Never to Harper. "Chase," Harper whispered. Her voice sounded thin, scraping against the cavernous silence of the vaulted ceiling. "Where is he?" Chase flinched. He reached into the inner pocket of his rented tuxedo. His hand shook so violently that the fabric of his jacket vibrated. He pulled out a piece of heavy cardstock, one of their RSVP cards, the ones Harper had spent 3 hours arguing with the printer over, because the gold foil wasn't the exact right shade of champagne. He didn't speak. He just held it out. Harper took it. Her fingertips felt numb, thick and useless, as if she were wearing winter gloves. "I'm sorry, Harp. I can't stay. He found out about the money. I have to go. Don't look for me." The handwriting was a messy, hurried scrawl, the pen pressing so hard into the paper it had nearly torn the thick stock. She stared at their ink, the loop of the Y, the sharp, panicked cross of the T. She didn't cry. There was no sudden, dramatic collapse. Instead, an intense, searing wave of irritation washed over her. The catering, she thought. We already paid for the sea bass. The silence in the church was beginning to curdle. Behind her, the 200 guests were waking up to the reality of the situation. It started as a low hum, the rustle of silk and taffeta as people leaned closer to their neighbors. Then, a sharp, distinct whisper from the third row. Preston's mother. The organist, an elderly man who had been nervously holding a low, continuous chord on the pedals, abruptly took his foot off, plunging the room into an acoustic void. The absence of sound was heavier than the noise. It pressed against Harper's eardrums until they ached. Her lungs felt too large for her ribcage. The custom-fitted corset of her gown, which had felt like an armor of elegance an hour ago, was now a vice. It squeezed the breath out of her in shallow, pathetic gasps. A single bead of sweat tracked a slow, itchy path down her spine, pooling at the small of her back. She looked out at the sea of faces. Aunts, uncles, college friends, co-workers. Their expressions were a kaleidoscope of pity, second-hand embarrassment, and morbid curiosity. They were watching a car crash in slow motion, unable to look away from the wreckage of her life. I should walk down, she thought. I should smile, tell them the reception is still on, and go drink until my liver shuts down. But her legs wouldn't move. The crinoline beneath her dress felt like lead weights. She was pinned to the marble floor by the sheer gravity of her own public humiliation. She was a statue of a bride, discarded and left on display. A sound cracked through the cathedral like a gunshot. Thud. The massive iron-wrought handles of the church doors were thrown open, hitting the stone walls with a force that rattled the stained glass windows. The whispers died instantly. The air in the room seemed to undergo a rapid drop in pressure. Harper blinked, the harsh light from the open doorway blinding her for a split second. A figure stepped over the threshold. It wasn't Preston, the man who walked down the center aisle, moved with a slow, deliberate cadence. His footsteps were heavy, the hard soles of his shoes striking the marble with a rhythmic crack, crack, crack. He wore a charcoal suit that didn't look new, but looked expensive in the way things do when they are cut specifically for the shoulders of the man wearing them. As he passed the pews, a physical ripple of reaction moved through the crowd. Men who ran hedge funds and owned summer homes shrank back against the wooden benches. Women held their breath, clutching their evening bags to their chests. It wasn't just fear. It was a primal, instinctual recoil. Harper recognized him, though she had never met him. Everyone in the city knew the face, usually from hushed conversations in dimly lit restaurants, or the occasional blurred photo in a newspaper article about a dismissed grand jury. Roman Adler. He didn't have the exaggerated swagger of a movie gangster. There was a brutal economy to his movements. No wasted energy. No performance. He walked with the relaxed posture of a man who knew that if he stopped, the rest of the world would stop with him. He reached the steps of the altar. Chase, standing a few feet to Harper's right, let out a pathetic, high-pitched squeak and took 3 rapid steps backward, nearly tripping over the microphone stand. Roman ignored him. He climbed the 3 marble steps, his dark eyes fixed entirely on Harper. Up close, he smelled of cold autumn air, dry cleaned wool, and a faint, sharp undertone of stale coffee. His face wasn't classically handsome. It was entirely too harsh. The angles of his jaw looked like they had been chiseled out of something unforgiving. A thin, jagged scar cut through his left eyebrow, interrupting the dark hair. He stopped less than 2 feet away from her. The proximity was a violation of the invisible barrier that usually separated a bride from the rest of the world. He looked down at the crumpled RSVP card still clenched in her fist. He didn't ask to see it. He just reached out, his large hand enveloping hers, and pried her fingers open with a gentle, terrifying inevitability. His skin was rough, calloused along the ridges of his palm. Roman read the note. His expression didn't change. A muscle in his jaw flexed once. $2 million, he said. His voice was a low rumble, barely above a whisper, meant only for her. It didn't carry to the pews. That's what your groom owes me. He borrowed it to cover a bad position on a real estate venture 6 months ago. He swore he'd have it today. Harper stared at his tie. It was a deep, bruised plum color, knotted perfectly, but pulled a 1/4 inch loose from the collar of his white shirt. I don't have $2 million, she heard herself say. Her voice was flat, hollowed out by shock. Roman looked up from the note, his dark eyes locking onto hers. They weren't cold. They were utterly, devastatingly awake. I know. Preston is currently on a private charter, headed for Costa Rica. He paid for the flight with the money he pulled from your joint checking account an hour ago. A fresh wave of nausea hit her. The joint account, the down payment for the house, the savings, everything. Her knees buckled by a fraction of an inch, the heavy dress sagging around her. Roman's hand shot out, gripping her elbow. His fingers dug into the soft flesh of her arm, anchoring her. The grip was entirely devoid of comfort. It was purely structural. You can stand here, Roman said quietly, the gravel in his voice vibrating against the heavy silence of the church. You can stand here and let these people look at you like you're a wounded animal. You can answer their questions. You can cry for them. You can spend the next 6 hours dismantling a party you paid for a man who left you with nothing. He let go of her elbow and took a half step back, offering his hand. The palm was broad, the lifelines deep. Or, he continued, you can walk out of here with me. Harper looked at his hand. The absurdity of it tasted like copper in her mouth. A Mafia Boss was standing at the altar of the First Presbyterian Church, offering to walk her down the aisle in reverse. It was a sick joke. It was a nightmare. She looked past him, down into the pews. She saw Aunt Linda, her hand covering her mouth, eyes wide with a horrific mix of pity and thrilled gossip. She saw her ex-co-workers whispering frantically. They were feeding on her ruin. Preston had taken her money. He had taken her pride. He had left her to drown in a sea of white tulle and public pity. Harper looked back at Roman Adler. She didn't know what he wanted. She knew men like him didn't do favors. He was a predator, and she was bleeding out in the open. But right now, the monster in the charcoal suit was the only person in the room who wasn't looking at her with pity. She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and impossibly strong. "Let's go," she whispered. The walk back down the aisle felt infinitely longer than the walk up. Every step was a bizarre synchronization of sound. The heavy, authoritative thud of Roman's leather shoes against the marble, followed by the sharp, erratic click of Harper's remaining heel, dragging the heavy rustle of a $10,000 silk skirt behind them. The guests parted like a physical wave. Nobody spoke. Nobody reached out. The silence was so absolute that Harper could hear the harsh, ragged sound of her own breathing. She kept her eyes locked on the heavy oak doors at the end of the nave, refusing to look left or right. Roman didn't rush. He walked at a steady, unhurried pace, his hand maintaining a firm, uncompromising grip on hers. It felt less like an escort and more like an arrest. Yet, strangely, the pressure of his palm was the only thing keeping her tethered to the floor. Without it, she felt she might simply dissolve into the heavy, floral-scented air. They passed the vestibule. They passed the guest book, sitting open on a pedestal, pristine and mostly empty. Then, they pushed through the doors and out into the crushing glare of the mid-afternoon sun. The heat of the city hit Harper like a physical blow. The air smelled of exhaust fumes, hot asphalt, and the distinct, yeasty scent of a nearby bakery. It was a jarring, violently normal smell after the stagnant, funereal air of the church. A black SUV idled at the curb. It was massive, a tank painted in high-gloss enamel, its windows tinted so dark they looked like obsidian. A man in a dark suit was leaning against the hood. He was smoking a cigarette, but the moment he saw Roman, he dropped it, crushing it under the toe of his shoe, and yanked the rear door open. He didn't look at Harper. He kept his eyes fixed firmly on the pavement. Roman stopped by the open door. He released her hand and gestured inside. Harper hesitated. The reality of what she was doing was finally piercing through the thick fog of adrenaline. She was getting into a car with Roman Adler, a man who casually talked about $2 million debts and flights to Costa Rica, a man whose name was usually followed by words like indictment and racketeering. "Get in," Roman said. It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't hostile either. It was simply a statement of fact. The transaction had been agreed upon at the altar. Harper grabbed fistfuls of her heavy skirt, bunching the expensive fabric together, and awkwardly hoisted herself into the back of the SUV. The interior was cavernous, smelling intensely of rich leather, ozone from the air conditioning, and a faint hint of peppermint. She sank into the seat. The dress, designed to look elegant while standing perfectly still, immediately betrayed her. The The crinoline poofed up, burying her in a chaotic mountain of white tulle. She had to violently shove the fabric down just to see out the window. The indignity of wrestling with her own clothing broke the cinematic tension of the moment, making her feel utterly, pathetically human. Roman climbed in beside her. The heavy door slammed shut, sealing them inside a soundproof vault. The noise of the city vanished instantly, replaced by the low, powerful thrum of the engine. "Drive," Roman said. The SUV pulled smoothly away from the curb. Harper stared at the tinted window. The world outside looked muted, washed out and grey. She watched the church shrink in the side mirror, watching the tiny, colourful specks of guests spilling out onto the steps behind them. They looked like confused ants. Silence stretched between them. It wasn't the suffocating silence of the cathedral. It was a heavy, expectant quiet. Roman reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a phone, and typed out a brief message. He didn't look at her. He seemed entirely unbothered by the fact that there was a woman in a wedding dress hyperventilating in the back seat of his car. The adrenaline that had kept Harper upright was rapidly burning off, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache. Her scalp throbbed where the heavy veil was pinned into her intricate updo. Without thinking, she reached up. Her fingers, shaking slightly, found the thick metal bobby pins biting into her scalp. She pulled. They caught on the hairspray-stiffened strands. She gritted her teeth and yanked harder. A sharp, stinging pain flared across her scalp as a few hairs tore out by the root, but the heavy comb came loose. She pulled the veil away, throwing the expensive cascade of lace onto the floorboard between her feet. She ran a hand through her ruined hair, dragging her nails against her scalp, relishing the dull sting. It felt real. It grounded her. Roman slowly turned his head to look at her. He eyed the discarded veil on the floorboards, then looked up at her face. Her makeup was likely ruined, her hair a chaotic, half-pinned mess, her breathing shallow and fast. He leaned back into the leather seat, resting his arm on the center console. "I prefer you without the lace," he said, his voice entirely deadpan. It was distracting. Harper let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. It was an ugly, broken noise. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice cracking. "To my office," Roman replied, turning his gaze back to the windshield. "Preston left a mess. You're going to help me clean it up." "I don't know anything about his business," Harper snapped, a sudden flare of defensive anger rising in her chest. "I'm a junior architect. I draw blueprints for municipal libraries." "I didn't know he owed you money." Roman turned back to her. The faint, barely perceptible shadow of a smirk touched the corner of his mouth, softening the brutal lines of his face for a fraction of a second. "I know," he said softly. "But you're his wife. Legally speaking." "We didn't sign the registry," Harper countered quickly, her architectural mind clinging to technicalities. "The ceremony wasn't finished. I'm not his wife." Roman's dark eyes scanned her face, lingering on the furious pulse beating at the base of her throat. "You stood at the altar in a white dress," Roman said, his tone low, vibrating with a quiet, undeniable authority. "In my world, and in front of 200 witnesses, he claimed you. And then he abandoned you, which means his debts are his own, but his assets." He leaned in slightly, the scent of bergamot and smoke washing over her. "His assets are up for grabs." Concrete pillars slid past the tinted glass in a hypnotic, strobing rhythm. The SUV descended deeper into the subterranean parking garage, leaving the suffocating afternoon heat behind for the damp, metallic chill of underground infrastructure. Harper kept her hands folded in her lap. Her knuckles were white, the skin pulled taut over the bones, contrasting sharply against the pristine, ruined silk of her gown. Roman hadn't said a word since they left the church district. He sat beside her, radiating a quiet, oppressive heat, his attention fixed on a tablet resting on his thigh. The blue light from the screen illuminated the sharp, unforgiving lines of his profile. He looked less like a man who had just hijacked a wedding, and more like a CEO reviewing quarterly losses. The vehicle lurched to a halt. Tires squealed softly against the sealed concrete. Hayes, the man driving, killed the engine. The sudden silence in the cabin was heavy, ringing in Harper's ears. "We're here," Roman said, his voice flat. He didn't wait for her to respond. He pushed his door open and stepped out into the harsh, buzzing glow of the fluorescent garage lights. Harper swallowed the dry lump in her throat. Her mouth tasted like stale adrenaline and morning breath mints. She grabbed handfuls of her skirt, the expensive crinoline scraping against her bare, blistered legs, and dragged herself out of the oversized vehicle. The air smelled of motor oil, damp earth, and exhaust. It was gritty. It felt real. She followed Roman toward a heavy steel door set into the concrete wall. Hayes walked a few paces behind her, his footsteps eerily silent for a man of his size. Nobody offered to carry her train. The yards of hand-beaded lace dragged across the grease-stained floor, collecting dirt and grit with every step. Harper didn't care. The dress felt like a costume from a play that had been cancelled halfway through the first act. Roman punched a code into a keypad. The steel door unsealed with a heavy pneumatic hiss, revealing a private elevator, lined in brushed steel and dark walnut. They stepped inside. The space was too small for the three of them, and the dress. Harper was forced to stand inches from Roman. She could smell the faint trace of nicotine on his coat, layered over a sharp, expensive cologne that smelled of cedar and black pepper. 42nd floor, Roman instructed Hayes. The elevator surged upward. Harper's stomach plummeted, the sudden shift in gravity threatening to bring up the half glass of champagne she had forced down hours ago. She closed her eyes, leaning her head back against the cool steel wall. The metal bobby pins still digging into her scalp pulsed with a dull ache. "Don't pass out," Roman murmured. He didn't look at her. He was watching the digital floor indicator climb. "I don't have medical staff on payroll." "I'm not going to pass out," Harper snapped. Her voice was raspy, stripped of its usual polite, professional timbre. "I'm calculating how long it will take to annul a marriage that never technically started." Roman let out a low sound, a brief, rough exhale that might have been a laugh if it had contained any humor. "Preston didn't just leave a marital mess, he left a financial crater. Annulment won't save your bank accounts." The elevator chimed softly. The doors slid open to reveal a sprawling, open-concept office suite. It wasn't a dark, smoke-filled mafia den. It was aggressively modern. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city skyline, the afternoon sun casting long, golden shadows across polished concrete floors. Glass-walled conference rooms stood empty. At a sleek reception desk, a woman in a tailored grey suit was typing furiously. She looked up, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of Harper's dirt-stained wedding dress, but her expression smoothed into professional blankness within a fraction of a second. "Hold all calls, Sarah," Roman said, striding past the desk without breaking his rhythm. "Yes, Mr. Adler." Harper trailed behind him, acutely aware of the absurdity of her presence. The silk rustled aggressively in the quiet, climate-controlled air. She felt like a walking, breathing punchline. Roman pushed open a heavy glass door at the end of the hall, gesturing for her to enter. His private office was vast and Spartan. A massive desk carved from a single slab of raw edge oak dominated the center of the room. There were no family photos, no decorative art, just stacks of manila folders, a multi-monitor computer setup, and a leather sofa that looked like it cost more than Harper's car. "Sit," he commanded, pointing to a rigid, mid-century chair opposite his desk. Harper didn't sit. She walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out. From this height, the city looked like a scale model. It was the way she preferred to look at the world, as geometry, as zoning grids and structural loads. It made everything feel manageable. "You said his assets are up for grabs," Harper said to the glass, watching the reflection of Roman taking off his suit jacket. He draped it over the back of his chair, revealing a holster strapped over his white button-down shirt. The dark leather stood out violently against the crisp cotton. She turned around, forcing herself to look at the weapon, then up to his face. "I'm not an asset. I have my own firm. My own income." Preston and I kept things separate. Roman sat down. He didn't look like a man preparing to argue. He looked like a man preparing to execute a foreclosure. He reached into the top drawer of his desk, pulled out a thick, cream-colored file, and tossed it onto the oak slab. It landed with a heavy, definitive smack. "Separate," Roman repeated. The word sounded foreign in his mouth. "Come here." Harper hesitated, the heavy tool wrapping around her ankles like a snare. She crossed the room, every step feeling like wading through wet cement. She stopped at the edge of the desk. Roman opened the file. Inside was a stack of legal documents, loan agreements, deeds of trust, promissory notes. "Preston bought 3 parcels of commercial land in the warehouse district," Roman said, his voice dropping into a low, transactional cadence. "He used my money for the down payment, expecting to flip the land to a corporate developer within 90 days. The developer backed out. The land is worthless. The zoning is dead." Harper frowned, her architectural instincts overriding her panic. "The warehouse district? You can't build commercial towers there. The soil foundation is a swamp. It requires deep pile driving that ruins the profit margin." Roman paused, his hand resting on the paperwork. He looked up at her, a flicker of genuine appraisal in his dark eyes. Preston didn't know that. Or he didn't care. He forged ahead anyway. He rotated the file and pushed it across the smooth wood toward her. "Look at the collateral line," he instructed quietly. Harper leaned forward. The corset of her dress dug viciously into her ribs, restricting her breath. She traced her finger down the dense legal jargon until she hit the signature block. Her blood turned to ice water. There it was. Harper Quinn. The looping H. The sharp, crossed T's. It was a perfect forgery. Below her name was the address of her architecture firm, the serial number of her business license, and the routing number to her firm's operational account. "He pledged your business as collateral," Roman said. He wasn't gloating. He was simply stating the autopsy results of her life. When he missed the deadline at noon today, the debt transferred to the guarantor. "You." Harper's vision blurred at the edges. The hum of the air conditioning suddenly sounded like a roaring jet engine. Her legs turned to water. She grabbed the edge of the oak desk, her knuckles turning white, to keep from collapsing onto the polished concrete floor. "That's a forgery," she choked out, her throat tight. "I didn't sign that." "Prove it," Roman said. She stared at him, her chest heaving against the stiff boning of her dress. "A handwriting expert. Will take 6 months in civil court," Roman interrupted, his voice a low rumble. "By then my associates will have liquidated your firm to recoup the losses. They don't care about your innocence, Harper. They care about the ledger." He stood up, towering over her. He rounded the desk, stopping just inches away. The smell of cedar and tension rolled off him. "I don't operate through the courts," Roman said softly, staring down at her. "Preston stole from me, and he used you to do it. You are legally, practically, and violently on the hook for $2 million. Harper looked at the forged signature. 10 years. 10 years of working 80-hour weeks, drafting blueprints in tiny, unheated apartments, kissing ass at municipal planning meetings just to get her firm off the ground. Preston had wiped it out with a stroke of a pen. She didn't cry. A strange, terrifying calm settled over her. The humiliation of the altar vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged fury. She looked up at Roman. You don't want my firm. An architecture firm's value is in its active contracts, not its physical assets. If you liquidate me, you get a few drafting tables and a broken espresso machine. You won't make a dent in $2 million. Roman tilted his head, his dark eyes narrowing by a fraction. And your point? My point is, you're a businessman, Harper said, her voice dropping, matching his volume. You didn't bring me here to gloat. If you wanted to destroy me, you would have let me stand at that altar, frozen my accounts tomorrow, and taken the firm without looking me in the eye. You need me for something else. Silence stretched between them. The only sound was the distant, muffled wail of a police siren several blocks away. Roman's jaw flexed. He reached past her, picking up a heavy crystal decanter from a side table. He poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a lowball glass and handed it to her. Drink, he ordered. Harper took the glass. The heavy crystal felt grounding in her shaking hand. She took a sip. It was Scotch, peaty, aggressive, and burning a hot trail down her throat. She coughed softly, the liquor forcing her lungs to expand. You're right, Roman said, leaning back against the edge of his desk, crossing his arms over his chest. I don't want your drafting tables. I want the land Preston bought to be worth something. Harper scoffed, taking another, larger sip of the Scotch. I just told you, the warehouse district is a swamp. Nobody is going to buy that land from you. Nobody in the private sector, Roman corrected. He leveled his gaze at her, the intensity in his eyes suddenly sharp enough to cut glass. But the city is looking for a site to build the new municipal transit hub, a $1 billion public works project. Harper froze, the glass halfway to her mouth. She knew about the transit hub. Her firm had submitted a preliminary design bid for the outer pavilions. The City Planning Commission, Harper breathed, the pieces rapidly locking together in her mind. They're choosing the site next month. Exactly, Roman said. Preston knew I had the money. He thought if he bought the warehouse parcels, he could bribe the zoning board to choose his site for the hub, then sell the land to the city at a 500% markup. But he couldn't pull it off, Harper guessed. He's a coward, Roman said flatly. The board pushed back, the bribe fell through, and he panicked. He took the liquid cash he had left from your accounts and ran. Harper stared at the blueprints peeking out from beneath the forged contracts. Her brain, trained to find structural pathways through impossible obstacles, began to turn. You want me to fix it, she said slowly. I sit on the Municipal Architectural Advisory Committee. I have the ear of the zoning board. You want me to convince them to approve the warehouse district for the transit hub. If the city buys the land, the debt is cleared. Plus a substantial profit, Roman said. He didn't smile, but there was a dark satisfaction in his tone. You save your firm. I get my money. That's illegal, Harper whispered. That's steering a public works project to benefit a private entity. It's corruption. Roman pushed off the desk, stepping into her personal space. He reached out, his rough, calloused fingers gently wrapping around the hand she was using to hold the Scotch glass. He lowered the glass away from her mouth. Harper, he said, his voice vibrating with a brutal, honest gravity. You are wearing a ruined wedding dress in the office of an organized crime syndicate, holding a forged document that legally signs your life away. The time to worry about corruption passed at approximately 2:30 this afternoon. He released her hand. "You have a choice," he continued. "Walk out that door. Go back to your empty apartment. Wait for the bank to call you on Monday and tell you you're bankrupt. Wait for my associates to seize your office." He paused, letting the silence hang heavy. "Or you sit down at this desk. You redraw those blueprints to make the swamp look like solid ground, and we take our money back." Harper looked at the door. Then she looked at the blueprints. She thought of Preston, sitting on a plane to Costa Rica, drinking stolen champagne, leaving her to take the bullet. A hot, toxic wave of hatred swelled in her chest. She set the Scotch glass down on the oak desk. The crystal hit the wood with a sharp, decisive clink. "Do you have a drafting pencil?" she asked. Hours bled into one another. The sky outside the floor-to-ceiling windows shifted from brilliant gold to bruised purple, and finally to a flat, starless black. The city lights flickered on, casting a neon grid across the dark office. Harper sat at the massive oak desk, her posture wrecked. The blueprints of the warehouse district were spread out before her, weighed down by heavy crystal tumblers and empty coffee mugs. The air smelled of graphite, cold espresso, and the sharp tang of sweat. She had been working for 6 hours straight. Her eyes burned, dry and scratchy from staring at topographical lines. Her right hand, clutching a mechanical pencil Roman had produced from a drawer, was cramped and aching. But the physical pain of working was nothing compared to the agony of the dress. The custom corset, designed to be worn for a few hours of graceful smiling, felt like an iron maiden. The stiff boning dug violently into her ribcage, bruising the soft flesh beneath her breasts. The heavy crinoline trapped the heat of her body, leaving her legs slick with cold sweat. Every time she reached across the desk to adjust the tracing paper, the heavily beaded sleeves scraped her underarms raw. She dropped the pencil. It clattered against the wood. Harper slumped back into the heavy leather chair, letting out a ragged, trembling exhale. The adrenaline that had fueled her through the afternoon was gone, leaving behind a hollow, vibrating exhaustion. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes, fighting back the sudden, overwhelming urge to shatter. A shadow moved across the desk. Roman walked into the circle of light cast by the desk lamp. He had taken off his tie hours ago. The top 2 buttons of his shirt were open, and the sleeves were rolled up over thick forearms dusted with dark hair. He was holding a glass of water. He set the water down next to the blueprints. "Drink it," he said. His voice was lower now, scraped raw by the late hour. Harper picked up the glass with shaking hands and drained it in 3 long swallows. The water was ice-cold, shocking her system. Roman didn't walk away. He stood on the other side of the desk, watching her. His gaze wasn't predatory, but it was dissecting. He was reading the tension in her neck, the shallow, painful way she was drawing breath. "You're suffocating," he stated. "I'm fine," Harper lied automatically, her voice cracking. "I just need to figure out how to bypass the EPA soil drainage requirements." "I'm not talking about the blueprints." Roman walked around the desk. Harper stiffened, her spine hitting the back of the leather chair. He stopped next to her. Up close, the sheer physical mass of the man was overwhelming. He smelled different now. The sharp cologne had faded, replaced by the warm, human scent of tired muscle and skin. "Stand up," he ordered softly. "I'm working," she protested, gripping the armrests. "Stand up, Harper." It wasn't a request. She slowly pushed herself to her feet. The heavy silk skirt dragged her down, the sheer weight of it making her sway slightly. She gripped the edge of the desk to steady herself. Roman reached out. Harper flinched, bracing for a harsh grip, but his hands bypassed her arms entirely. He stepped behind her. "What are you doing?" she snapped, a sudden spike of panic piercing through her exhaustion. "You can't breathe," Roman said, his voice directly behind her ear. The low vibration of his words sent a bizarre, involuntary shiver down her spine. "And you look like you're going to bleed onto the drafting paper. Turn around." She hesitated, her architectural brain warring with her survival instinct. Finally, she let go of the desk and turned her back to him. The dress fastened with a row of 40 tiny silk-covered buttons running from the nape of her neck down to the small of her back. It had taken her sister and 2 bridesmaids 20 minutes to loop them all with a crochet hook that morning. Roman didn't have a crochet hook. She felt the rough, calloused pads of his fingers brush against the bare skin at the nape of her neck. Harper sucked in a sharp breath. The contrast between his brutal, violent hands and the delicate, impossibly small buttons was jarring. He didn't fumble. There was a terrifying precision to his movements. He started at the top. Click. The first button slipped free of its loop. Click. The second. The heavy silk began to loosen around her collarbone. Harper closed her eyes, fighting a sudden, humiliating wave of tears. It wasn't supposed to be like this. These buttons were supposed to be undone by Preston in a honeymoon suite in Santorini, with champagne and nervous laughter. Instead, she was in a mafia front, smelling of stale coffee, being undressed by a man who collected blood debts. "You're shaking," Roman observed quietly. His knuckles grazed her spine as he worked his way down to the middle of her back. "It's cold in here," she lied. "It's 72 degrees. He didn't press the issue. He just kept working. Click, click, click. As the corset unspooled, the physical relief was agonizing. Her lungs expanded to their full capacity for the first time in 12 hours. A long, shuddering gasp tore out of her throat. She sagged forward slightly, the rigid posture she had held all day finally collapsing. Roman finished the last button at the small of her back. He didn't step away immediately. He let his hands rest briefly against her waist, over the loosened silk. It wasn't a caress. It was a heavy, anchoring weight. A silent communication that she wasn't going to fall. Then he stepped back. "Hold the front," he instructed. Harper crossed her arms over her chest, gripping the heavy bodice to keep it from pooling at her feet. She turned to face him. Roman walked over to his leather sofa. Earlier in the evening, Hayes had dropped a duffel bag on the cushions. Roman unzipped it and pulled out a pair of dark grey sweatpants and a black, heavy cotton t-shirt. They were clearly his. He tossed them onto the desk. "There's an executive bathroom down the hall to the left. Wash your face. Put those on," he said, turning his back to her to look out the dark window. "Leave the dress on the floor. I'll have someone burn it." Harper looked at the pile of dark, soft cotton. The thought of putting something soft against her bruised skin made her want to weep with gratitude. She clutched the ruined wedding dress to her chest, grabbed the clothes, and walked out of the office. The bathroom was a sanctuary of marble and dim, recessed lighting. Harper locked the heavy door, dropped the sweatpants on the counter, and finally let go of the dress. It pooled around her ankles in a heavy, pathetic heap of white tulle and lace. She stepped out of it, kicking it into the corner of the room. She stood in front of the mirror in her sheer tights and silk undergarments. The woman looking back at her was a stranger. Her intricate updo was destroyed, sections of hair hanging in limp, hairspray-crusted strands. Dark circles bruised the skin under her eyes. Red, angry welts lined her ribcage where the corset had dug in. She turned on the faucet, letting the hot water run over her hands, then splashed it roughly against her face. She scrubbed away the expensive waterproof makeup, dragging a coarse paper towel over her skin until it was flushed and raw. She stripped off the undergarments and pulled on Roman's clothes. The sweatpants were massive, She had to roll the waistband 3 times and yank the drawstrings tight just to keep them on her hips. The black t-shirt fell halfway down her thighs. The fabric smelled faintly of his laundry detergent, something sterile and unscented, and that lingering, underlying scent of cedar. She rolled up the sleeves of the shirt, letting her bare feet sink into the cold marble floor. When she walked back into the office, the overhead lights had been turned off. The room was lit only by the warm glow of the desk lamp and the ambient neon bleeding in from the city outside. Roman was sitting on the leather sofa. He had poured himself a fresh glass of scotch. He looked up as she entered. He took in the oversized clothes, her scrubbed, bare face, and the chaotic mess of her hair. He didn't smile, but the hard, impenetrable mask he wore seemed to fractionally soften. "Better?" he asked. "I look like a hostage," Harper muttered, walking over to the desk and sinking back into the chair. The soft cotton against her bruised ribs was a luxury she couldn't articulate. "You aren't a hostage," Roman said, taking a slow sip of his drink. "A hostage doesn't have a pen. You have the pen, Harper. You hold the leverage on $1 billion municipal project." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, staring across the room at her. The shadows deepened the scar on his eyebrow. "Preston thought he was playing a game he could walk away from," Roman said quietly. "He left you as the sacrificial lamb. But he made a mistake." "What mistake?" she asked, her voice raspy. "He underestimated what happens when you strip everything away from a person," Roman replied, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "He took your money, your pride, and your future. He thought it would break you." Roman raised his glass slowly in a silent, grim toast. "But he forgot," Roman murmured, the words wrapping around her in the dark room. "People with nothing left to lose are the most dangerous people in the world." Harper looked down at the blueprints. The topographical lines no longer looked like an impossible swamp. They looked like a map to a war. She picked up the mechanical pencil. The graphite scratched softly against the paper as she began to draw. Roman watched her from the shadows, listening to the sound of the pencil. For the first time all day, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The terms of their survival were set. Fluorescent lights hummed a harsh, insectoid drone, baking the smell of burnt coffee and cheap carpet cleaner into the windowless municipal boardroom. Harper stood at the head of the heavy mahogany table. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer that armored her shoulders, her hair pulled back into a severe, unyielding knot at the base of her skull. Her mouth was dry. 5 city planning commissioners sat across from her. They were men and women, composed entirely of zoning codes and bureaucratic fatigue. They shuffled thick stacks of paper, their expressions a collective wall of skepticism. "Ms. Quinn," Councilman Miller said, tapping a plastic pen against his legal pad. The sound was sharp, erratic. "Your firm's proposal for the warehouse district is structurally ambitious, but the geological surveys are a nightmare. The water table is too high. You're building $1 billion transit hub on a sponge. The deep pile driving alone will hemorrhage the city's budget." Harper didn't flinch. She felt the heavy, quiet weight of Roman's presence in the back of the room. He sat in a plastic folding chair that looked entirely too small for his frame, dressed in a black suit that absorbed the terrible lighting. He hadn't spoken since they walked through the double doors. He didn't need to. He was the loaded gun resting on the table. She was simply the one pulling the trigger. "You're looking at the water table as a liability, Councilman," Harper said. Her voice was steady, projecting easily across the stale air. She clicked the remote in her hand. The projector screen behind her shifted from a topographical map to a complex, multi-layered schematic. "I'm looking at it as an asset," she continued. "Traditional deep-pile foundations cost a premium, yes. But we aren't just pouring concrete. We are installing geothermal heat pumps directly into the structural pilings. She stepped to the side, letting the harsh white light of the projector illuminate the cross-section. The swamp you're worried about maintains a constant subterranean temperature. By integrating a closed-loop geothermal system into the necessary structural foundation, the transit hub will generate 80% of its own climate control. You spend $20 million upfront on the driving, and you save $150 million in municipal energy grid costs over the next decade. It becomes the first carbon-negative public transit hub in the country. Silence fell over the room. The clicking of Miller's pen stopped. Harper watched their eyes move over the schematics. She had spent 3 sleepless nights in Roman's office drafting these plans. She had lived on black tea, the smell of graphite, and the low, constant presence of the man on the leather sofa. She had hollowed out her grief and poured the empty space full of raw, spiteful geometry. The EPA grants for carbon-negative infrastructure, a woman at the end of the table murmured, pushing her glasses up the bridge of her nose. They would cover the foundation costs entirely. They would, Harper confirmed flatly. And they would put this board on the cover of every architectural and public works journal in the hemisphere. Miller stared at the screen, a slow, greedy calculation shifting the lines of his face. He looked at the other board members. Nods were exchanged, micro-movements of bureaucratic surrender. Harper exhaled slowly through her nose. The adrenaline spike wasn't triumphant, it was exhausting. She tasted stale toothpaste and victory. 20 minutes later, they were in the elevator. The doors sealed shut, cutting off the noise of the municipal lobby. Roman hit the button for the parking garage. The brushed steel walls reflected the dark exhaustion under Harper's eyes. She unbuttoned her blazer and let her head fall back against the cold metal paneling. The tension in her spine began to uncoil, leaving her limbs feeling like liquid lead. "They bought it," she whispered, staring at the ceiling grate. "They didn't buy it," Roman corrected. His voice was a low rumble in the confined space, vibrating against the acoustic paneling. "You cornered them. You gave them a way to be greedy and look righteous at the same time. It's the only pitch that ever works." Harper turned her head to look at him. His tie was perfectly knotted. The scar over his eye caught the harsh elevator light. He was looking at her, his dark eyes stripping away the charcoal blazer and the professional veneer, seeing the terrified, furious woman who had ripped the bobby pins out of her own scalp a month ago. "The land value just quadrupled," Harper said. "The city will finalize the purchase order by Friday. You'll have your $2 million back, plus a severe profit. Yes. So my firm is clear. The forged deed is nullified." Roman reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. He pulled out the original cream-colored file, the one that had felt like a death sentence on his oak desk. He held it out to her. Harper took it. She flipped it open. Across the bottom of the collateral agreement, over her forged signature, the word "void" was written in thick, aggressive black marker. Beside it was Roman's signature. She stared at the thick black ink. A sudden, violent lump formed in her throat. She had spent a month fighting for her life, ignoring the betrayal, ignoring the humiliated bride she had left on the floor of his bathroom. Now that the war was over, the grief was waiting to tear her apart. "Thank you," she managed to say, her voice cracking. "You bought your own life back, Harper," Roman said quietly, the elevator chiming as it reached the garage. "I just provided the drafting table." Rain lashed against the corrugated tin roof of the shipping warehouse, a deafening, rhythmic assault that drowned out the noise of the adjacent harbor. The air inside smelled of wet rust, motor grease, and the brackish scent of the ocean. Harper stood near a stack of wooden pallets, wearing a heavy trench coat over her work clothes. She was shivering, though she wasn't sure if it was the damp chill of the warehouse or the corrosive dread pooling in her stomach. Hayes stood by the massive rolling door, smoking a cigarette. The cherry flared bright red in the gloom. "He's here," Roman said. Harper turned. Roman emerged from the shadows of a rear office, his heavy boots making no sound on the concrete floor. He wasn't wearing a suit today. He wore dark denim and a thick wool sweater, looking entirely like a man who belonged to the violence of the docks. Behind him, two of his men were dragging a figure across the floor. They dropped the man at Roman's feet. Preston groaned, a wet, pathetic sound that scraped against Harper's eardrums. He pushed himself up onto his hands and knees, his breath hitching. He looked terrible. The expensive haircut was grown out and greasy. His face was a patchwork of peeling sunburn and a fresh, dark bruise blooming along his jawline. He wore a rumpled linen shirt that smelled intensely of stale airline liquor and sour sweat. He didn't look like the man she had planned to marry. He looked like a stranger. He looked small. Preston wiped his mouth with the back of a trembling hand and looked up. His eyes locked onto Roman first, wide with a frantic, animal terror. Then his gaze shifted past the heavy boots, past the dark sweater, and landed on Harper. "Harp!" he choked out. Harper didn't move. She thought she would feel a rush of vindication. She thought she would want to scream, to hit him, to demand answers for the devastation he had casually tossed over his shoulder. Instead, a profound, sickening wave of disgust washed over her. It was a physical revulsion, like finding mold growing inside a piece of bread you were about to eat. "Harper, please!" Preston scrambled to his knees, his hands clasped together in front of his chest. Tell him I'm good for it. I needed time to flip a different asset. I was coming back for you." "You drained my firm's operational accounts, Preston," Harper said. Her voice sounded foreign to her own ears. It was entirely devoid of emotion, flat, cold, and heavy. "You forged my signature on a collateral deed for a Mafia loan. You left a note on an RSVP card." Preston flinched. He looked at Roman, then back to Harper, a desperate, manipulative shine coating his eyes. "He made me do it, Harp. These people, they threatened me. I had to run to keep you safe." Roman let out a low, rough exhale. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't pull a weapon. He just reached down, gripped a fistful of Preston's filthy linen collar, and hoisted him to his feet with terrifying ease. Preston let out a high-pitched yelp, his toes barely brushing the concrete. Roman looked at Harper over Preston's shoulder. "I brought him back because the debt is settled. But the insult isn't," Roman said, his dark eyes pinning her in place. "He belongs to you. Do whatever you want. If you want him to disappear, Hayes will put him on a boat that doesn't dock. If you want his legs broken, I'll break them." Preston began to hyperventilate, clawing weakly at Roman's thick forearm. "Harp, no, please, God, no." Harper stared at the man she had loved. Or the man she thought she had loved. She realized now she had loved an architectural rendering of a man, a polished facade with no structural integrity behind it. She stepped closer. The smell of his unwashed fear made her stomach turn. "I don't want your legs broken, Preston," Harper said softly. Preston let out a sobbing gasp of relief. "Thank you, baby. Thank you. I swear I'll make it right." "I don't want your legs broken," Harper interrupted, her voice slicing through his pathetic rambling, "because I want you to walk to the bankruptcy court." She reached into her trenchcoat pocket and pulled out a thick envelope. She slapped it against Preston's chest. Roman's grip kept him upright as he fumbled to catch it. "Those are the annulment papers," Harper stated, her tone surgical. And the civil lawsuit I filed yesterday morning for the embezzlement of my corporate funds. I froze your remaining domestic accounts at 9 a.m. You have absolutely nothing left." Preston stared at the envelope, his jaw slack. The terror in his eyes morphed into a pathetic, hollow defeat. "You can't," he whispered. "I'll go to jail." "You probably will," Harper agreed. "But you won't go to a mafia grave, which means I'm being incredibly generous." She looked at Roman. The dark, brutal corners of his mouth were turned up in a faint, unmistakable shadow of a smile. He let go of Preston's shirt. Preston collapsed back onto the concrete, clutching the envelope to his chest like a shield. "Get him out of my sight," Harper said to Hayes, not looking at Preston again. Hayes gripped the back of Preston's collar and dragged him toward the rolling doors, hauling him out into the lashing rain. Harper stood in the silence of the warehouse, listening to the rain hammer the tin roof. The adrenaline crash hit her instantly. Her hands began to shake. She shoved them deep into the pockets of her trench coat, clamping her jaw shut to keep her teeth from chattering. Roman walked over to her. He didn't offer a platitude. He didn't tell her she did the right thing. He pulled a silver flask from his coat, unscrewed the cap, and handed it to her. Harper took it. She drank. The liquor burned a brilliant, agonizing trail down her throat, settling hot and heavy in her stomach. "He's a ghost," Roman said quietly, taking the flask back. "You just exorcised him." "I feel sick," Harper admitted, staring at the wet concrete. "You're supposed to," Roman replied. He stepped closer, blocking the damp draft coming from the door. His sheer physical mass radiated heat. "Survival isn't pretty, Harper. It just keeps you breathing." 3 months later. The drafting room of Harper's firm was quiet. The junior architects had gone home hours ago, leaving only the soft glow of the articulated desk lamps and the faint, rhythmic hum of the central heating. Harper sat at her massive drafting table, a mechanical pencil tucked behind her ear. She was reviewing the final material load limits for the transit hub's outer pavilions. Her firm had not only secured the zoning board's approval, but the city had officially contracted her team as the lead architectural consultants on the project. She was exhausted, but it was a clean, earned exhaustion, the kind that built muscle. The heavy glass door at the front of the office clicked open. Harper didn't look up immediately. She recognized the cadence of the footsteps. Heavy, measured, rhythmic. Roman walked into the drafting room. He was wearing a dark wool overcoat, his shoulders dusted with fine, powdery snow. He carried a flat, rectangular leather portfolio under his arm. He walked over to her table, brushing the snow off his coat before setting the portfolio down on the edge of her workspace. "You're working late," Roman observed. His voice was lower, a familiar, rough timbre that sent a quiet warmth unspooling in her chest. "Concrete requires supervision," Harper replied, pulling the pencil from behind her ear. She leaned back in her chair, studying him. The dynamic between them had shifted over the last 90 days. It wasn't the frantic, hostage-like tether of the first night. It had calcified into something solid, something grounded in mutual respect and the shared, ugly knowledge of what they were both capable of. He didn't treat her like a civilian anymore, and she didn't look at him like a monster. "What's in the portfolio?" she asked. Roman unzipped the leather case. He pulled out a stack of blueprints, printed on heavy, high-quality stock, and spread them over her transit hub schematics. Harper leaned forward, her professional curiosity piqued. She scanned the lines. It was a commercial space, a massive, multi-level structure with reinforced load-bearing walls and a complex subterranean layout. "This is a nightclub," Harper murmured, tracing the flow of the foot traffic with the blunt end of her pencil. "But the acoustic paneling is integrated into the load pillars. And the basement?" She paused, her brow furrowing. The basement has dual ingress points and a secondary ventilation system that bypasses the municipal grid. She looked up at him. "You bought a new property?" "I did," Roman confirmed. He rested his hands on the edge of her drafting table, leaning his weight forward. The scent of cold winter air and cedar washed over her. "The current layout is a liability. It needs a retrofit. Something that looks entirely legitimate to the fire marshal, but serves my specific operational needs." Harper tapped her pencil against the paper. She understood exactly what he was asking for. A front. A fortress disguised as entertainment. "My firm only takes on legitimate municipal and commercial contracts, Mr. Adler," Harper said, keeping her voice perfectly even, though the corner of her mouth twitched. Roman's eyes locked onto hers. The dark intensity in his gaze was absolute. It wasn't a threat, it was a profound, unyielding anchor. "This is a legitimate commercial contract," Roman replied smoothly. "I'm offering double your standard consulting rate, paid in clean, traceable municipal bonds, and I need the architect who outsmarted the zoning board to draw it." Harper looked back down at the blueprints. She could see the structural flaws immediately. She could see how to fix them. She could see how to build a foundation that nobody could ever tear down. She had stood at an altar in white silk, waiting for a boy to save her. She was never going back to that. Harper picked up her mechanical pencil. She clicked the top, the sharp graphite extending with a satisfying snap. She pressed it against the heavy paper, right over the flawed, load-bearing pillar. "You're going to need to reinforce the eastern foundation," Harper said, her voice dropping into the quiet, serious hum of her profession. "The soil there is unstable." Roman watched the sharp line of her jaw, the focused, lethal intelligence in her eyes. He reached out, his rough, calloused fingers gently brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. The touch was fleeting, but it burned like a brand. "I know," Roman said softly in the quiet room. "That's why I brought it to you. Did this raw, gritty mafia romance keep you on the edge of your seat? If you loved watching Harper transform from a discarded bride into a ruthless architect of her own fate alongside the city's most feared boss, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss a thrilling chapter of our dark, grounded audio dramas. Share this video with fellow romance lovers who crave messy, real, and fiercely unyielding protagonists. Drop a comment below with your favorite moment. Thank you for listening and supporting our channel.